The Navy today confirmed earlier media reports that the USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class fast-attack submarine, collided with an unidentified submerged object during maneuvers in the South China Sea. According to Navy Department spokesman Lieutenant Commander Flobby McButtshark, while the nature of the underwater object remains a matter of conjecture, the Navy's Investigating Underwater Disasters Department, also known as IUD for short, has performed a thorough investigation of the incident and determined with a reasonable degree of confidence that it was caused by white supremacy and unconscious bias, and the crew will undergo a rigorous program of woke diversity training when the Connecticut returns to port. Asked by reporters whether the Navy had considered the additional remedial action of relieving the boat's captain of duty and replacing him with a captain of color, Lieutenant Commander McButtshark replied that this course of action was contemplated, but ultimately rejected, as it was thought such a replacement might negatively affect the boat's maneuverability, since studies have shown that submarines with black captains are 20% larger on average. And speaking of the Navy, America's greatest hero of the high seas, Admiral Hunter Biden, is in the news today, having sold half a dozen so-called paintings this week at a so-called art show, attended by the so-called best and brightest people in Los Angeles, for sums ranging from $75,000 to a high of a cool $500,000, according to an LA Times art critic who was forced to attend the show and say nice things about the so-called paintings under threat of being fired and having to watch his whole family be waterboarded, said, "Sure, it's probably a stretch to call Mr. Biden an artist, and it's probably a stretch to call these things paintings, but if you get drunk enough and remove your glasses, I could almost say that I wouldn't immediately demand different accommodations if I saw one of these monstrosities hanging on the wall in my room at the No-Tell Motel. And besides, I have a wife and several small children, and I just want them to not be horrifically tortured." In other news, reports surfaced earlier today that Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Democrat of Arizona, has been refusing to take the phone calls of President Joe Biden. According to a statement issued by her office, Senator Sinema began rejecting the president's calls early last week because the president kept saying the exact same thing, and she was tired of being told she has the yummiest smelling hair of all the senators, and one more sniff isn't all that much to ask. And speaking of President Biden, I keep doing that. He was in Ohio yesterday, mumbling some mostly unintelligible nonsense where the only words that could be clearly heard were, "Yeah, my grandpop used to say," I had two grandpops, actually. One was my mom's dad, and the other was my dad's dad, and my one grandpop was from a town, well, not really a town, more of a small city, and it was just outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, and this was back when they had coal in Scranton. Did you know they used to have coal in Scranton? So my grandpa moved to a town, well, not really a town, more of a large village, really, in Wilmington, Delaware. I mean, not in Wilmington, outside, on the outskirts of Wilmington. And my grandpa used to tell me, "Joey," oh, shucks, will you look at that? They're out of time. They're telling me I have to go. I'm out of here, folks. Build back better. The assembled press corps didn't have the slightest idea what President Biden was attempting to say until they were able to locate a drunk homeless man under a nearby bridge who was all too happy to provide a Biden to English translation in exchange for a cheeseburger and 2 bottles of Thunderbird. And Jim Eagle, if you don't hit the music in the next 2 seconds, then you ain't black. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we create more shovel-ready jobs than Joe Biden's economy each time one of the horses takes a dump. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And we need to talk about Mitch McConnell. As you are no doubt already aware, there are plenty of reasons to be displeased with the senior senator from Kentucky, both in general terms and today in particular. But you want to know what the greatest service was that Mitch McConnell ever performed for his country? Keeping Merrick Garland the hell off of the Supreme Court. You may know Merrick Garland as the current Attorney General of the United States, the guy who is promising to throw the Patriot Act at you and prosecute you as a domestic terrorist if you show up at your local school board meeting and have the temerity to complain about mask mandates or racism or pornography or radical transgenderism, which at this point are basically the 4 academic pillars of K through 12 public education in most of these here United States. But you may remember Merrick Garland as a one-time candidate for the Supreme Court nominated by Barack Obama, America's 44th consecutive white male president, in addition to being the first black one, to fill the vacancy that was created by the untimely and unexpected demise of Justice Antonin Scalia on 13 February of that same year, 2016. Now, from the date of his nomination 5 weeks later on 16 March 2016, all the way until it ultimately expired on 3 January 2017, with the end of the 144th Congress, with no hearings and no Senate vote having taken place, the Obama administration and the congressional Democrats and the fake news performance artists, they all flatly assured us the whole time that Merrick Garland was a card-carrying judicial moderate, that he wasn't any sort of political ideologue, that he was a faithful servant of the Constitution, a studious, dedicated legal scholar who was the most well-qualified nominee in the entire history of the Supreme Court, which seems pretty quaint today, since he's now an Attorney General who has expressly stated his intent to use the full power of the Justice Department and federal law enforcement apparatus to arrest, prosecute, and imprison law-abiding U.S. citizens who publicly express trepidation about their kids being inculcated as wild-eyed, America-hating Marxist revolutionaries in the public schools that they pay for, and in the contents of whose curriculum they always naively believed they were entitled to an opinion. Oh, what? You thought you were the primary stakeholder in the content of your child's education? What? Just because you're the parent and the taxpayer? Oh no, says Merrick Garland, faithful servant of federalism and dutiful guardian of the Constitution. You best start disabusing yourself of that belief, or else there is a cozy 6x8 cell waiting for you at the federal supermax prison, you loathsome domestic terrorist, you. Now you may find yourself asking, what the hell business is it of the Federal Department of Justice? What goes on at a local school board meeting? If there's a crime committed by a parent at a school board meeting, shouldn't that be within the jurisdiction of the local authorities in that particular city or town or county? And to anyone who is possessed of a rudimentary understanding of the basic principles of federalism, who has even a passing familiarity, a grade school level grasp of how our system of government works, or is supposed to work, those are all perfectly reasonable questions, which Merrick Garland doesn't think he should have to answer. For now, the U.S. government, under the leadership of President Biden, has declared open war on your right to have any say in the content of the curricula that are taught in the public schools that your kids attend. And there is an instructive lesson here, I think, in who really wields political power in this country, because all it took was the National Teachers Union Association, whose leader is an actual, literal, wild-eyed Marxist revolutionary named Randy Weingarten, firing off a letter to the Justice Department saying, you know, we're really getting sick of these angry parents thinking they have a right to an opinion about what gets taught in the public schools they pay for. And since we deliver such huge amounts of campaign cash and massive numbers of votes to the Democrat Party every election year, do you guys think you could maybe just declare them all domestic terrorists and prosecute them under the Patriot Act and throw their asses in prison? And since every single organ of the national government now functions for the sole purpose of making sure Democrats win elections, Merrick Garland immediately answered, well, yes, ma'am. Will there be anything else? Do you want us to torture him too? Because it really wouldn't be too much trouble at all. We at the Department of Justice just want to make sure you're happy so we don't jeopardize the flow of that sweet, delicious campaign cash when election season rolls around. Now, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you have heard me state my belief more than once that there is an urgent need for political contributions by public employee unions to be outlawed. And I would submit that this move by the Justice Department paints the urgency of that need in starker relief than it has ever been painted before. This is an association of public employee unions basically requesting that the government arrest and prosecute their critics and their political opponents, and the government saying, well, sure, okay. And yes, I do know perfectly well there is a First Amendment counter-argument that says, but wait, public employee unions should be able to make political contributions just like anybody else. And you're infringing on their free speech rights if you take action to prohibit that. Except that argument no longer holds enough water to drown a housefly, because now individual law-abiding citizens are having their own free speech rights and their parental rights and potentially their very freedom sacrificed on the altar of the teacher union's desire and ability to use its political clout to effectively order the Attorney General of the United States to weaponize the apparatus of federal law enforcement as a punish anyone who criticizes certain Democrat Party campaign donors. When the powerful are able to use their free speech right to deprive the powerless of their free speech rights and to persecute and terrorize them on an industrial, unprecedented scale, that is where the right to free speech can and should end. The FBI is not supposed to be anybody's personal goon squad. When it becomes one, then an urgent need exists for a legislative remedy so that cannot happen anymore. And frankly, based on its recent track record of incompetence and political showmanship, the FBI ought to be abolished altogether, if you're asking me, but that's a different discussion for a different episode. So needless to say, Merrick Garland should be ashamed of himself, and so should Mitch McConnell, because yes, McConnell absolutely did perform an invaluable service to his country by keeping this maniac off of the Supreme Court bench, but I will never understand why Supreme Court nominations are the only area in which McConnell is willing to go to the mat and do battle and see things through to the end. Not for the good of his own constituents in Kentucky, but also for the larger good of the country and its people. Because in every other corner of the political arena, he always winds up folding and capitulating and giving the Democrats at least 95% of what they want. That's what the word bipartisanship means to guys like McConnell and Willard Romney and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and I could go on, but you're already familiar with the names in that Hall of Shame. The Hall of Shame where you give the other side 95% of what it wants instead of 100%, and you call it bipartisanship. And you engage in orgies of self-congratulation, acting like you're some master of political brinkmanship afterward. But let's call things what they are. The Republicans are not a conservative party. They are neither a socially conservative party nor a fiscally conservative party. If there were any fiscal conservatives in Washington, federal spending would not have increased by 405% in the first 2 decades of this century. If there were any social conservatives in Washington, the radical leftists wouldn't get every single crazy thing they want, which they always do, because nothing terrifies the Republican Party more than actually taking a stand and going to the mat for the principles that conservatives actually value and care about. The GOP establishment still can't figure out why Donald Trump inspires the kind of loyalty he does, but it is not difficult to figure out, because Trump is the only guy in Republican politics in the last 40 years who meant what he said, who attempted to do right by his voters and didn't stab conservatives in the back every chance he got. Nothing about this is rocket surgery. There is no Donald Trump personality cult. Trump doesn't inspire loyalty because people think he's a likable guy. He inspires loyalty in spite of being an unlikable guy, because he doesn't shit all over the people who entrusted him with their vote the minute he gets into office. When there's only one guy in your whole stupid party who's like that, you bet your ass he's going to inspire loyalty. If other Republicans acted that way, if they comported themselves as having a solemn responsibility to actually do the things they said they would do, the GOP wouldn't be seen as so utterly loathsome by its own voters. And make no mistake, in the entire 160-year history of the current political duopoly, no party's voters have detested their own party as much as Republican voters detest the GOP today. The Democrats, they can't run the government for 9 months without every single thing turning into a big steaming pile of shit. So it's pretty freaking hilarious when President Biden, when he's speaking clearly enough to be understood, assures the country that he can fix the pandemic, fix the economy, even save humanity itself from the existential threat of the sun monster, if you just give him more money and more power. The Republicans, if they understood the first thing about political calculus, or hell, political arithmetic, would know enough to just stand by and do nothing and let these maniacs dig their own political grave. But last night, just like clockwork, Mitch McConnell and his gang of 11 stooges, for reasons known only to themselves, decide to bend over and cave in and give the Democrats a reprieve that they didn't have to give them. And you know it's bad when there's even a Democrat senator, Joe Manchin in this case, who has no idea what the hell you're thinking. Every year we get a big overwrought argument about how much we're going to raise the debt ceiling. And it never occurs to anybody to raise their hand and say, how about let's spend less money? If there were any fiscal conservatives in Washington, if there was a single fiber of fiscal conservatism in the DNA of the Republican Party, would that be the case? Hell no, it wouldn't. If there were any conservatives in Washington, we'd be having the one conversation that we desperately need to have, which is about the extent to which the federal administrative state and the federal government in general needs to be massively, radically, drastically downsized and disempowered. Because in its current state, as the many-tentacled swamp monster it's become, it is intrinsically and fundamentally hostile to the principles of self-government and individual liberty around which our republic was founded in the first place. And as long as we keep switching back and forth every few years between the donkey swamp and the elephant swamp, these two corporate brands that masquerade as political parties, absolutely nothing will change, and our country's decline will just get more inexorable, more impossible to arrest and reverse, and our road to ruin will become a one-way street. I do not want to be a member of the generation on whose watch the American experiment ended in failure, and I really, really don't want to die in a prison camp. But from where I sit today, if I'm being honest, I have to rate both of those possibilities as more likely than not. You may remember last week in the Roadmap to Reform video where I laid out my argument for why getting rid of the 17th Amendment is one of the most important things we need to do if we're going to be able to salvage this thing and pass it down in some recognizable form to the generations that are yet unborn. And the antics last night by Mitch McConnell and his gang of 11 dipshits are the best object lesson I could have asked for. Although don't get me wrong, I wish they wouldn't try so hard to prove me right. With popular election and 6-year terms, senators can get away with acting like they are not accountable to anyone for anything. But if we got rid of the 17th Amendment and went back to the Senate existing the way in which it was originally constituted, when senators were directly accountable to the state governments, if the Kentucky legislature met today and 3/4 of its members were ready to vote to recall Mitch McConnell's ass, he would stop being a senator the moment that vote was certified. And that is what accountability looks like. Nearly everybody else in the country, everybody who works in the real world and the private sector, if they screw the pooch and perform badly and don't perform their duties to the satisfaction of their employer, they risk being fired. They risk being relieved of duty with immediate effect. And I'm telling you right now, if we went back to having a Senate that worked that way, that worked more like the real world, and functioned less like a House of Lords aristocracy where you basically are installed for life, the people in it would be a hell of a lot more responsive to the desires of the citizenry, and I suspect a hell of a lot more attentive to the manner in which they carry out their professional duties. Thanks for watching. Here's wishing everyone a pleasant weekend. I will see you Monday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.